Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Today we will recap a cinematic masterpiece that unfolds the extraordinary life of one of history's most iconic figures. Immerse yourself in the grandeur of sweeping landscapes, intense battles, and the captivating charisma of Napoleon Bonaparte as the film explores the triumphs and tribulations of this legendary leader. Brace yourself for a thrilling journey through history, brought to life with stunning visuals and a compelling narrative that transcends time. In 1789, revolution began in France after people became frustrated with the political and social environment. After the fall of King Louis XVI, people kept an eye on Marie Antoinette. In 1793, Marie Antoinette was arrested and sentenced to death by guillotine. People on the street threw trash at her as she moved forward, and everyone cheered after her decapitation, her head revealed in triumph. In the crowd, an ambitious young Corsican captain named Napoleon Bonaparte was watching. Maximilien Robespierre came to power as the Reign of Terror began in France. Napoleon and his brother Lucien met with Paul Barras, a revolutionary leader, to carry out the siege of Toulouse, despite limited resources. Napoleon developed a strategy to attack cities near the port. His horse was hit by cannon fire, but he persevered and defeated British forces on land, as well as by blowing up their ships on the ocean. Napoleon later attained the rank of general. Robespierre was deposed, and after a failed escape attempt, he made a failed suicide attempt. He was sentenced to the guillotine, and the subsequent Reign of Terror ended with the release of more than 40,000 prisoners. Napoleon attends a summer ball where he meets Josephine de Beauharnais for the first time and an aristocratic widow. Josephine's son, Eugenie, went to Napoleon and asked if he could take back his late father's sword at his mother's request. Napoleon randomly took a sword and returned it, beginning a flirtation with Josephine. The two began a sexually active relationship and eventually married. We then see Napoleon leading a suppression of royalist activities and uprisings, gunning them down in the streets. Napoleon then went to liberate Egypt in the Battle of the Pyramids. During her absence, Josephine began an affair with a soldier, Hippolyte Charles. Napoleon returned home, although he was warned that this would be considered desertion. He came home and threw all of Josephine's belongings out in the rain when she returned home from a trip. Napoleon coldly reprimanded her for her infidelity, even though he had previously had a relationship, even though he insisted he was not in love with any other woman. Josephine also responded that Napoleon was nothing without her. The board of bishops met with Napoleon for desertion, but he instead criticized them for misdirecting France. Napoleon was persuaded by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès to stage a coup so that he could become first consul. After forcing the current leaders to resign, the coup breaks out, and Napoleon and Lucien convince their troops to help them fight the resistance. Napoleon then crowned himself Emperor of France and Princess Josephine, but he surprised everyone by snatching the crown and placing it on his head, posing as the nation's savior. Soon, Napoleon worked with Caulaincourt and the Talleyrand foreign minister to try to form an alliance with the Austrians in Britain, but was rejected. Napoleon has a childish reaction to this, shouting at the king's messenger and storming off. A year later, Napoleon concentrated his troops at Austerlitz to fight the Russians and Austrians. He lured them onto the ice while he and his men waited in the woods, and he used cannons to break through the ice, pushing the enemy into the icy waters. Napoleon then dined with Austrian Emperor Francis, while Tsar Alexander refused out of anger at the loss of his troops. Napoleon also told Francis to be grateful that he did not destroy his entire army. Napoleon and Josephine continuously failed to have children, depriving him of his inheritance. His mother, Laetitia, forced him to sleep with a young woman to see if he was the cause of infertility. Laetitia later reported to Napoleon that he had impregnated the young girl, so he and Josephine soon arranged a legal divorce. They held the ceremony before an assembly, where Josephine hesitated while reading her part of the decree, and Napoleon slapped her until she finished reading it. She was sent to live at Malmaison Castle, where she and Napoleon continued to communicate and send letters to each other. Napoleon met Alexander to try to woo one of his sisters, but his sister was engaged and the other was too young. He then arranged an alliance with Austria by marrying Archduchess Marie-Louise. She bore him a son a year later. Napoleon burst into tears when he saw his child and then took him to see Josephine. 1812. Napoleon began planning to invade Russia due to Alexander's refusal to rejoin his peace treaty. He led his army at the Battle of Borodino, which killed more than 28,000 French soldiers, but they still won. When they arrived in Moscow, they found the city completely evacuated. After setting up camp, Napoleon woke up to discover that the city had been burned by Russian troops. While Napoleon wanted to advance to catch up with the Russian army, he was informed that it would not survive the winter if it made this trip. The army retreated towards France with nearly 500,000 dead along the way. Because of this, Napoleon was later forced to abdicate the throne and go into exile on the island of Elba. In 1815, Napoleon continued to write to Josephine until he learned that she had fallen ill. He left the island and made his way back to France before finding his old soldiers and convincing them to remain loyal to him. When Napoleon returned to see Josephine, he learned from his daughter that she had died of diphtheria. Napoleon mourned his ex-wife. Napoleon added his army to face Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, and his army at the Battle of Waterloo. A bloody battle began, and while Napoleon's army gave it their all, the British overwhelmed them. Napoleon was forced to retreat when the Prussian marshal's forces pursued his army and surrendered. Napoleon took a moment longer to greet Wellesley. Napoleon was once again sent into exile, this time to the island of St. Helena. He spends his time writing his memoirs while the two girls play nearby. He told them that he was the one who burned down Moscow even though they had heard otherwise. Napoleon then heard Josephine's voice calling him to join her, and a moment later he fell to the ground. The final text determines that Napoleon Bonaparte died in 1821. Under his command, in more than 80 battles, more than 3 million enemy soldiers were destroyed. Her last words are attributed to Josephine of the French army. Thanks for watching our video. If you enjoyed this film recap and want more, subscribe now, like, and share captivating stories with your friends. Tell me which movie you'd like me to summarize next. See you soon.